thank you to Borg Innovation for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. I appreciate it. So my name is Stephen Ezell. I'm a senior analyst at a think tank in Washington, D.C. called the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. We're a technology and economic policy think tank that focuses on advocating for public policies that drive innovation-based growth in the United States, in our states, and in the broader global economy. Before I joined ITIF in 2008, I had, in the year 2003, co-founded a firm called Peer Insight, which was a service innovation research and consulting firm in which we brought 50 corporations together in what we call the Global Services Innovation Consortium to exchange best practices around service innovation and services business model development. So that's how I initially came to know Richard and Peter. And so my experience then on service innovation is both at the firm level and then at the country level with policy. So I think it's an interesting combination that hopefully we can get some insights from today. So as Peter mentioned, my role in this project has been to primarily author 4 comparative case studies that look at company pairs side by side and assess how they've leveraged the service innovation triangle to create innovation. The 4 company pairs are Nokia versus Apple, Borders versus Amazon, Facebook versus MySpace, and Kodak versus Xerox. And so as not to go through all 4, we'll just focus on 2 today, Xerox and Kodak, and Facebook versus MySpace. And I think the service innovation triangle is very powerful because it says that there are 9 levers or lenses or channels of innovation that you can innovate from. And you can also look at your competitive space and see where you are weaker or stronger vis-a-vis your competitors. And when we look at Xerox versus Kodak, what we have really are the story of 2 iconic American Fortune 100 industrial companies, both started over a century ago, Kodak in the 1880s, Xerox in 1906. But we have now the story of one company that has been able to survive into the digital age because it was able to transform its business model in a customer-centric way, whereas the other company, in this case Kodak, wasn't unable to. So when you think about the story of Kodak, what's really interesting is that if you take it up to the late 1990s, the early 2000s, you see that Kodak was on top of the world. When you look at Kodak's share price, at an all-time high, around $120, 100,000 employees. And what happened there, that spike, was a result of the globalization of the world economy that occurred now at the end of the 1990s. So we had China joining the World Trade Organization, for example, and this opened up vast export opportunities for Kodak in Asia. You had these, literally billions of consumers in China and India coming online, and they all wanted digital photography. I mean, they all wanted photos and film. And so Kodak was just doing fantastically. But there's something called the innovator's paradox. And this says that oftentimes for companies, by the time you know you need to innovate, it's actually too late to innovate. And so the story we'll see at Kodak is where they should have been bringing new products and services online here into the 2000s. They were unable to do so because they had those products sitting on the shelf, and I'll explain why. So when we go back and think about how these companies compare on the 9 elements of the service innovation triangle, I think of essentially the one in which Kodak was the strongest was with regard to tangible assets, in this case specifically its brand. Just the company had incredible brand loyalty. In the 1970s, Kodak accounted for 85% of camera sales and 90% of film sales. Up through the year 2000s, Kodak was the 5th most recognized brand in the entire world. That survey was taken in 2007. Just 5 years later, this company would be bankrupt. Xerox itself wasn't so bad with regard to its brand. The company's name was actually synonymous with its service. So you'd often say, I'd like to Xerox something, and of course that's pretty impressive when you're like Google, and the verb is actually your brand name for the service you provide. And it also is one of the top 100 most recognized brands in the world. So, Kodak had a lot of leverage in the brand, but we'll see it fail to do so. So what really happened? Well, these are companies that were founded initially through breakthrough technologies. Xerox, of course, by inventing the technical ability to xerography, or to make copies, and Kodak's case, in the 1880s, they really got their advantage by making the camera very easy to use. It used to be a very complex process to take photographs, only professionals could do it. Kodak built cameras that were easy to use for the consumer. But taking the story forward to the 1990s, what was amazing was that Kodak invested $4 billion developing digital photography capability, digital cameras. But because Kodak made 80 cents on the dollar for every unit of film it sold, and it knew that when we moved into a world of digital photography, it would only make 5 cents on a dollar for every digital photograph taken, it recognized that to introduce digital cameras would be to completely cannibalize its existing film business, where it made the majority of its profits. So through the 1990s, it spent $4 billion developing this technology, and it just let it sit there on the shelf. And in fact, it wasn't until the year 2000 that they actually brought digital cameras forward. So essentially, at the end of the day, Kodak was essentially disrupted by the very technology it invented itself. And as the downturn at Kodak accelerated over the last couple of years, the CEO, Antonio Perez, announced large cuts in R&D and the closure of innovative units geared towards new technologies. So when they really had to innovate, they didn't have the money and the resources at that point in time to bring themselves into the future. In contrast, you look at Xerox, even in their leanest years, they continued to invest in R&D and innovation. And in fact, today at Xerox, 2/3 of their revenue comes from products and services they've introduced in just the past 2 years. So when you look at it from the business model perspective, again, the story with Kodak is one that was never fundamentally able to move away from this dominant razors and blades business model, if you will, or cheap sales of cameras subsidized by the sale of a film that they can monetize at a high price point. And to the extent that later Kodak tried to diversify its business, it didn't go into services at all. It only thought about how it could diversify its product line. So it focused on moving into digital imaging, radiological imaging, but still focused on the product. If you look at what Xerox did, in contrast, it brought itself back from the brink of bankruptcy in the year 2001 by focusing on services and servicizing many of its product lines. So in particular, it introduced a new offering called Managed Print Services, in which the company took on all the printing and copying duties for the corporation and changed the business model so that the company only paid for each unit of printed page output. It also diversified into health IT, consulting, electronic health records, government toll collection systems, moved entirely to a services model. And in fact, today, services account for more than 50% of the $22 billion in revenue that Xerox has. Now, the question is, why wasn't Kodak able to make this leap into services? And when you think about it, if you were in the United States growing up, you would see Kodak commercials, and their tagline was that Kodak was in the business of sharing memories, sharing lives. And if you think about that, if they had been really customer-centric about sharing memories and sharing lives, why not just create a facility on the internet where customers could come and they could post photos, and then they could tag the photos of the people who were in them, send comments about the photos to their friends. Essentially, the idea for Facebook was just 2 steps away for Kodak if they had thought about developing customer-centric service offerings. And in fact, they sensed this a little bit. In the year 2001, they purchased the company Ophoto, which at the time was the web's largest provider of online albums. But as James O'Keefe said, what Facebook did was people-centric, and what Kodak was doing was photocentric. We couldn't make the leap to enabling social media and sharing experiences online. As Joaquin said, we were dominated by an engineering culture that was completely technology pushed, completely technology centric. We couldn't think about the human element at all. In contrast, at Xerox, when they turned themselves around in the year 2000, or in the decade of 2000s, their CEO, Anne Mulcahy, was very explicit in saying, in trying to rebound, we spent the majority of our time talking to customers and understanding their needs. And in fact, they entirely reorganized their company so that now leading Xerox executives are tied to key accounts, and that increases accountability for customer satisfaction. So at the end of the day, when you look at it from the value perspective, Xerox's managed print services now turn a fixed cost into a variable cost for their customers. The companies, instead of having resources that are focused on printing and copy reproduction, can streamline and reduce their overhead because Xerox manages this for them. Companies like Procter & Gamble estimate that going to the Xerox managed print services has reduced their paper use by 40% and cut their cost by 25%. So, and that's creating real value for their customers. And then interestingly, now that P&G manages print services for scores of different companies, they can understand what works best for different companies. They can cross-pollinate best practices among the clients they serve. And so then they can price these services at a very profitable price point for Xerox. So it enables them the ability to capture some of the value that they're creating. And in contrast now, Kodak has gone bankrupt and is divesting itself of the few patent assets it has. So I think this is a good story of two companies, and one, by being company-centric, was able to create a services-based business model for the digital era and revive itself. So let's look at the triangle then as well in the terms of Facebook versus MySpace. And what's interesting here in these social media companies is that Facebook was able to differentiate itself from MySpace and from Friendster, which was actually probably the very first social media company. But it was able to distinguish itself by creating a unique and compelling member and advertiser experience that it was then able to monetize through a business model that allowed Facebook to make money while also creating money for its partners in terms of both its advertisers and the developers who sold applications on its website. And I think when you look at 7 of the 9 elements of the service innovation triangle, Facebook very clearly bested MySpace. So first you think about the member experience. And if you, how many of you ever use MySpace? No? How many use Facebook? Okay. So going back to the original MySpace, MySpace let its members design their web pages in whatever way they wanted. And this led to, it resulted in a vast wasteland of cluttered and annoying pages, as users could put their videos, photos, widgets, in whatever kind of chaotic format they wanted on the various on their web pages. But Facebook came along and very intentionally created a dominant theme of a cleaner Google-like interface that resonated much more with a mainstream mass audience. So their pages were cleaner, much more easier to use, just much more easier to engage with for a mass audience. Taking some of these concepts of design that Apple has used so effectively. And Google, if you recall, the original Google website was just a search term, right? It was very sleek, compelling design. But Facebook was attuned that you didn't have to think only about the member experience, you had to think about the advertiser experience as well. And because these MySpace pages were so cluttered, it didn't mean there was a ready-made or easy place for advertisers to advertise on the page. So this resulted in essentially MySpace users being bombarded with ads, and they had to be bombarded because the process was so efficient that the advertisers weren't getting click-throughs. In fact, MySpace's advertising click-through rates were just 4 in 10,000. which was 1/5 of the industry average. So Facebook comes along and says, look, we need to develop a site that allows basic ads to be placed in under 10 minutes and put in place a very simple procedure for advertisers to load their advertisements. So they created this 3-step process here: build your Facebook page, connect with people, engage your audience. They were great about giving their advertisers feedback about which ones of their advertising campaigns were working, which weren't, providing very granular data so that advertisers could experiment with the best ways to advertise on the site. Just very thoughtful about the advertising experience. Facebook also focused on investing in technology innovation. So Facebook was the first one to introduce news feeds, and of course this was the feature that allowed you to have your comments, your posts, your likes, your dislikes to be fed directly to your friends, and those of your friends to be fed directly to you. Facebook was the first to open its website to third-party developers like Farmville, which enriched the social media experience. In contrast, MySpace just didn't really invest in technological innovation behind the website. It took MySpace 18 months after Facebook introduced its newsfeed for MySpace to introduce theirs. Facebook was 1 year ahead of MySpace in terms of introducing the application development for third parties. It took MySpace 1 year after Facebook got there for them to do it. And part of the problem was actually the site design. So MySpace had been built on the Microsoft .NET platform, and this was a very technologically unstable, unsound platform, and it meant that it took application developers 10 to 15 times longer to code an application on MySpace than it did for Facebook. So it was just a very poor experience for the developers. And at the end of the day, as one MySpace executive said, Mark Zuckerberg's great strength was that he and his team focused on product development and innovation, while MySpace had become concerned with meeting some revenue targets from a deal they did with Google. So Facebook clearly out-innovated MySpace. People was another problem for MySpace. MySpace was located in Los Angeles. This was not a hotbed for developer talent. It was very difficult for MySpace to attract top-flight engineers. In contrast, Facebook was a magnet for the best and brightest in technological skill. MySpace also had a problem that after there was investment by Rupert Murdoch's News Corp in Facebook, it meant that they weren't able to offer stock offerings to attract the best and the brightest. So from a people perspective, in regards to the triangle, another area MySpace really fell behind Facebook. Then we come to the business model, very simple. As I said, MySpace, the click-through rates were 4 in 10,000. It was a very poor experience for advertisers, so they rapidly fled the site. And ultimately, MySpace was never able to build this bi-directional business model that created value for customers and also for advertisers and partners. In contrast, Facebook was able to do that and really build this powerful combination of network effects, economies of scale, and mass customization. At the end of the day, when you think about value, it's just amazing. 1/7 of the world's population is on Facebook. The average Facebook user spends 29 minutes a day using Facebook and generates 55 million posts. When you're able to have a business that looks has a hockey stick like this, and that shows you the percentage of amount of time internet users spend at a particular website, when you account for 16% of the time that an average person spends on the internet, you have a pretty good business. And I think this is an interesting story of how, by focusing on developing a compelling customer and partner experience, that Facebook was able to create value for customers and actually capture part of the value for itself and for its partners. So across these 4 case studies then, what are some of the extractable lessons and insights we can draw, and then also from the broader value-driven service innovation project? I'd say the first is that when the elements of the service innovation triangle interact, overlap, and reinforce one another, but it's very good in reminding you that you always have to create value for 3 parties: your customers, your partners, and yourself. I think it's also important to recognize that companies can't focus on technology alone. You have to focus on creating compelling customer experiences. You look at like Nokia. I mean, even today, Nokia is all about developing the best mobile phone. Their new Lumia line has got very cool features. It's got like wireless charging. You can put it on a pad. It charges wirelessly. It's got some of the best the retina displays, the best resolution. But it's just about the phone itself. It's not about creating an ecosystem for partners. It's not about creating this broader customer experience. Companies like Nokia, like Kodak, entirely miss that it's about the customer. But I think the point is, if you had talked to like Henry Ford, and Henry Ford was famous for saying, if I asked my customers what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse. So the point is, we just can't say, oh, well, we've done some surveys, we've done some market research, we've asked the customers what they want, and that's enough. No, we have to go to a deeper level to understand unstated, unmet, tacit customer needs. We have to deploy social research tools like ethnography, like observational research. Ultimately, we have to understand our customers better than they understand themselves if we want to successfully innovate. You have to build open platforms so that partners can make money alongside you. All these companies, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, great stories of building IT platforms that enable partners to make money with their business. Fourth, you have to be willing to disrupt your own business model. Just because you're not willing to cannibalize your existing product or service does not mean that a competitor won't come along and do it for you. If you talk to Jeff Bezos of Amazon, he would tell you that Amazon is in the business of putting Amazon out of business. That's a pretty interesting statement. What does he mean by that? Well, he means that Amazon originally, of course, destroyed existing bricks and mortars bookstore models by going to an online model of selling books, right? But now, Bezos wants to destroy that model of selling books and movies and whatever online by completely digitalizing that process and selling you ebooks that you read through your Kindle reader, and you pay for the download of the book, just like you pay for the download and so on iTunes. So the point is, innovation is a continuous process. Innovation is never done. The competition never stops. And so you have to make your firm a serial innovator and recognize that innovation is like a muscle. And if you don't use that muscle, if you don't build that muscle with learning new methods, new tools, new techniques of thinking about innovation, then that muscle will atrophy, it will wither away and die. Innovation's a muscle. You absolutely have to use it. With Richard and Peter, we partner on a program that I know many of you have been on to come to Silicon Valley in March for a course on entrepreneurship and innovation in Silicon Valley. And we go visit companies like Apple and Facebook and see how they innovate, and we get immersed in this culture of innovation in Silicon Valley, and everybody's charged up and revved up, and it's a great week. And then I think, though, sometimes you come back and you get the sense of, well, that was a nice experience, but that's just the way the Valley operates. That's a unique part of the world, and we can't have that everywhere, right? But I think the point is, your firm may not be in Silicon Valley, but Silicon Valley has to be in you. It's got to be part of your culture and your organization. You don't have to be there. You have to have its culture in you. And then the fifth point I would make is that, simply put, products can no longer survive as standalone offerings in the digitalized services era. If you sell products, you got to wrap around those products value-added services, like analyzing the data that the devices generate, like service maintenance contracts. You got to move to a services-based business model. Finally, just let me say, Richard, I think you said I would make some public policy comments at the end. I'll just make one very briefly. So the 2013 Innovation Union Scoreboard came out a couple of weeks ago, and this is a scoreboard of 35 European countries comparing essentially their innovation competitiveness, if you will. And in this study, Norway is pegged as a, quote, moderate innovator, innovating on the level of, say, a Croatia or a Serbia. And I just don't think that's audacious enough for the innovation potential of Norway. And if you look at where Norway fares less strongly in the scoreboard, there were two areas in particular. One was that Norwegian firms tended to not invest enough in non-R&D innovation activity. There was strong investment in technological and science-based innovation, but not enough into these non-science-based innovation activities, like business model innovation, like customer experience-based innovation. So I think this value-driven service innovation model is one useful way to deal with that challenge. The other challenge, which was related, was that compared to their broader European peers, new to the firm or new to the market innovations in Norway are much lower. And so I think this model as well is helpful in thinking of how we can innovate at a stronger level in Norwegian firms and society. Anyway, I look forward to answering your questions, and I very much enjoyed the opportunity to be here with you this afternoon. Thank you.